So we spent yesterday's Morning Pitt talking about how important high school recruiting still is and how valuable it is, and how schools like Pitt are still going to have to build their rosters and the foundation of their rosters out of high school recruiting. They can't just rely on the transfer portal. But in the process of having that conversation yesterday, started thinking about the transfer portal, and we were talking about the guys that Pitt has landed, some of the standout players Pitt has had and gotten out of the transfer portal, and how they've sort of figured into it. I was making the point about how so many of the important players and successful players over the last 10 years have been high school recruits. I mean, Pitt's last 2 first-round draft picks were high school recruits. 3 if you count Jordan Addison, and we can have a separate debate about that. But there's no doubt that they've obviously, in the process of naming all of those guys, I was, of course, compelled to think about all the transfers who have made a big impact at Pitt. And as I ran down that list, something started standing out to me. Something started sticking out about the transfers who made a big impact at Pitt and where they've come from, and more importantly, which side of the ball they've played on. Because it feels like there's a bit of an imbalance, and that probably tells us something that maybe you already knew, but we're going to talk about it anyway. So let's talk about the transfers. Where has Pitt gotten the most help from the transfer portal over the last 4 years, or the last few years, I should say? We're talking about that here on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. Hanging out with you this morning, trying to get through I say this morning because it is the Morning Pitt, and I assume that you watch this in the morning, but maybe you don't. Maybe you watch it in the afternoon, so I'm hanging out with you this afternoon, or I'm hanging out with you this evening, whenever it may be that you watch these videos. It doesn't matter the time of day. I appreciate it all the same, and I ask you to do the same thing. Like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, so you don't miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content. These daily Morning Pitt videos, our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night. We'll have that tomorrow night at 8:30 right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And what else? Post-game shows, press conferences, interviews, all kinds of things, all kinds of video content, all centered around Pitt, all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, and then you won't miss any of it. And, of course, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. It's a Pitt site on the 247 Sports Network, where we would love to have you come and hang out and talk a little Pitt sports with us. We have Pitt football, basketball, recruiting, transfer portal coverage, and, of course, the message boards where you can talk to other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Pitt fans are hanging out on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. All right, let's talk about the transfer portal, what Pitt has gotten out of the transfer portal, where they've gotten the most help, and kind of what that tells us. And, why delay? Pitt has gotten a lot more out of the transfer portal on offense than it has gotten out of defense. And this is actually what inspired me to start thinking more about this yesterday, is when I was saying that, last year, 2024, Pitt's leading passer was from the transfer portal. Pitt's leading rusher was from the transfer portal. Pitt's leading receiver was from the transfer portal. And on defense, all you could really come up with was Pitt's leading tackler, which is not insignificant. Donovan McMillan had 115 tackles last year. And so it's not like he was just a bit player or, part-time contributor. But when you've got the leading passer, rusher, and receiver all coming from the portal, in addition to your starting center and a number of other contributing players throughout the offense, there's a bit of an imbalance there. And that's what got me thinking about previous years, because last year wasn't the first year where you could say that. Sure, in 2023, Rodney Hammond was the leading rusher, but your leading passer was still Christian Veyer, a transfer. Your leading receivers, I forget if it was Kanate Mumfield or Bum Beans, but it doesn't matter because they were both transfers. You go back to 2022, obviously Izzy Abanikanda was your leading rusher. He was a high school recruit. Jared Wayne was your leading receiver. He was a high school recruit. But Keaton Slovis was your leading passer. He was your starting quarterback. And again, another transfer. And I think when you go over the list of guys really over the last 3 seasons, we could probably date it back to 2020 or 2021. Look, I guess the line of when we officially entered the transfer portal was probably, for me, was after the 2021 season when Jordan Addison went in, but it had started earlier than that. You remember the announcement that Kenny Pickett was coming back after the 2020 season. I think the transfer portal was a thing at that point, and there was some consideration given to him, potentially going into the portal and maybe even transferring to Notre Dame. So I go back over the last 4 seasons, maybe 5 seasons, and I think about the transfers that Pitt has brought in, where they've brought in the most guys, how those guys have fit in, and who's made the biggest impact. I mean, at quarterback, you've got the top quarterbacks from each of the last 3 years, basically everybody since Kenny Pickett, and everybody before Kenny Pickett as well, as far as contributing leading quarterbacks, we're all transfers. Holstein, Vare, Phil Dracovic, Keaton Slovis, all transfers. At running back, you've had Desmond Reed and Sebo Flemister and Derek Davis have come in as transfers. And this is not meant to be an all-encompassing list. I'm just thinking about guys who have contributed. And maybe Davis hasn't contributed all that much, but Sebo Flemister, right, was a number 2 back in 2023 behind Rodney Hammond. This past year, Desmond Reed is the number 1 guy, a transfer. The wide receivers, I mean, they've gotten a lot out of transfer wide receivers, probably more than they've gotten out of high school recruits. Because, I mean, if you think about high school recruits at wide receiver for Pitt, basically since Jordan Addison, so you go over the last 3 seasons, 2022, 23, and 24, I mean, who's contributed out of the high school ranks? Jared Wayne had a big year in 2022. They got him over 1,000 yards with that Miami game. And Kenny Johnson should be the man this year. He hasn't quite taken that mantle yet. But basically everybody else who's been good over the last 4 years, unless I'm forgetting someone, and I just mean who's been good, but I mean who's been a contributor, over the last 4 or 5 years has been a transfer. You remember DJ Turner, as far back as that, coming in from Maryland in 2020, had 44 catches for 630 yards and 3 touchdowns. Taysier Mack came in before him, but still played into the 2020 and 2021 seasons and was important. And I mean, he was a transfer, came in from Indiana. Dejon Reynolds made some big plays. Obviously, a huge catch against West Virginia. I don't know, Pitt wins that game without that catch from Dejon Reynolds against West Virginia last year. Bub Means, made the best of a bad situation in 2023. He wasn't quite ready in 2022. In 2023, I think he was really good. He was a transfer. Obviously, Kanate Mumfield, like we talked about. The guys this past year, Sincere Lee and Raphael Williams, like some of your top receivers, almost all of your top receivers in the past few years have been transfers. And going into this year, they brought in 3 transfer wide receivers in Deuce Spann and Blue Hicks and Andy Jean. Andy Jean left Pitt again, went back into the transfer portal after spring camp, but Deuce Spann and Blue Hicks are here. They're going to be in the rotation, probably both top 6 guys, along with Williams and Lee. So that's 4 out of your top 6 are going to be transfers, along with Kenny Johnson and, either one of the freshmen or one of the younger guys, Tyreek Robinson, Zion Fowler-El type. But basically, most of your top 6 are going to be guys who transferred in. At tight end, some of the best production they've gotten at tight end was from Lucas Krull in 2021, a transfer. Gavin Bartholomew played well that season, but he didn't match Krull's production that year and hasn't matched it since, over his next 3 years. And the number 1 tight end this year will be a transfer, Jake Overman. And the number 2 tight end will probably be Malachi Thomas, who was a high school guy. But then behind him is going to be Justin Holmes, a transfer from Marshall. Same thing with the offensive line this year. And I mean, they've been going to the transfer well for offensive linemen for a number of years. Lyndon Cooper, obviously moved into the starting lineup as the starting center this past season, and he'll keep that role into this year. We know they brought in a lot of transfers this year, but I mean, you could go back over and find plenty of guys. Ryan Jacoby came in as a transfer. Stefano Millen back in the 2018 season. That's pre-portal, but still came in as a transfer. They've tried to supplement their offensive line with transfers as much as they can. It hasn't always worked out, but they've tried to fill that group in with players from the transfer portal. And this year, 3 out of the 5 starters at a minimum are going to be players who transferred into Pitt, with Lenny Cooper, along with some grouping of, Kendall Stanley and Jeff Percy and Keith Gouveia. I always forget if I'm pronouncing that right. But we'll figure that out by the time the season starts. So, a heavy dose on offense. Now, conversely, on defense, you think about what they've gotten over the past few years out of defensive players, And it's nothing to sneeze at. John Patrician was very good in 2021. He was an important player. Tyler Wiltz in 2022 had 50 tackles, as a transfer. That was pretty solid. Shane Simon came in from Notre Dame, had 94 tackles over the course of 2 seasons, 13 tackles for loss, 7 sacks in 2 years. Pretty solid production. Starting middle linebacker his second year, 2023. MJ Devonshire, 7 interceptions over the course of 2 years after transferring from Kentucky. Or over the course of the 2023 and 2024 seasons, including, the monster pick 6 in 2022, which I didn't even count on here. I had 7 interceptions that was 7 interceptions in 2022 and 23. Excuse me, not 23 and 24. I got my math written down wrong here, but 7 interceptions as a transfer. Nate Matlack, had a decent year last year, 7.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. It wasn't as much production as Pitt needed out of the defensive end position, but it was still, I think he was second on the team in sacks, or, he might have been behind some of the linebackers. He was second among the defensive ends in sacks. We can say that, behind Jimmy Scott, a recruit. And then Donovan McMillan, 220 tackles over the course of 2 years, coming in as a transfer from Florida. So they've gotten good production, but we're talking about 5 or 6 guys there. Depending on how you want to rank Matlack. And Patrician his transfer might have been sort of pre-transfer portal. So maybe you're talking about 4 or 5 guys, depending on what you think of Tyler Wilt, Shane Simon, MJ Devonshire, and Donovan McMillan. However many you want to say, 4 to 6 significant contributors on defense from the transfer portal in the last 4 seasons. 4 to 6, that's not a small amount. But they've had 4 to 6 significant contributors at wide receiver from the transfer portal over the last 4 seasons. So you see the disparity there. Not to mention 3 quarterbacks, a couple running backs, a couple tight ends, and, probably 4 to 6 offensive linemen, in addition to all of those wide receivers. They've gone to the transfer portal far more for offense than they have for defense, and they've needed to go to the transfer portal more for offense than they have for defense because, as we get to our big conclusion here, conclusion in terms of like gathering all these facts and then drawing a conclusion, they've had to make up for the poor recruiting on offense. And I don't think I'm breaking any new ground there. I don't think it's breaking news for anyone that Pitt hasn't recruited great on offense over the past 5 years, 10 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the constant change at offensive coordinator has been part of it. Turnover on the offensive coaching staff, although the staff itself was relatively stable for most of the 10 years until they completely overturned it 2 years ago. But the constant change at offensive coordinator, and quite frankly, Pitt hasn't been all that great offensively. They've had some standout seasons, 2021 for sure, 2016 for sure, and 2018 where they had 3,000 rushing yards and 2,000-yard backs. But what's interesting about all those years, 2016, 2018, 2021, those years that probably were high watermarks in terms of offensive production, they changed offensive coordinators. 2016 was Matt Canada's only year here. 2018 was Sean Watson's final year here. 2021 was Mark Whipple's final year. And I'm not saying there's entirely connection between Pitt's offense peaking and then the coordinator leaving or being pushed out the door, however that may go. But I don't think it helps you build any recruiting momentum when you're trying to recruit on the offensive success you had. Now the coordinator's gone. You're doing something completely new. I think it makes it a little bit tougher to recruit to that. And I think that the holes have shown, the gaps have been shown in the offensive recruiting when they've had to go and supplement from the portal like they have and bring in as many offensive guys as they have. A trend that continues this year with 3 offensive linemen, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, a quarterback, right? They got another quarterback this year. Really the only thing they didn't address in the transfer portal on offense was running back. So it's the continuation this year of trying to fill in those gaps. And that's where Pitt has needed it the most, and that's where they've gotten the most help. All right, we will be back again tomorrow, getting closer to the big official visit weekend coming up. We'll be talking about it a lot tomorrow night on the Panther-Lair Show right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And you get all the previews and rundowns of the official visit weekend right there at Panther-Lair.com, Pitt site on the 247 Sports Network. So make sure you check that out. And stay up to date and get ready for a big weekend of recruiting coming up. All right, make sure you like this video and subscribe. Don't forget to do all of that. Thanks for watching today. Hope you have a great Tuesday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.